Here on our channel, people's stories come to life. Stories from different eras, professions, and destinies. Each of them follows their own path, their own life woven from circumstances, challenges, and choices. Before we step into their world, make sure to subscribe, and later, share your impressions in the comments. Now, let's begin. Some stories don't start with loud events. They start small, with details, with moments that seem insignificant, yet hold entire worlds within them. These are stories about people who never chose to be heroes. They simply lived, worked, made mistakes, learned from them, and kept moving forward. The lives of such people unfold like a slowly blooming flower, each petal revealing itself in its own time, each layer hiding new secrets, new pains, new joys. This is a story from a time when the world was just a little different. The shop stood halfway down a narrow close, where the stone walls leaned toward one another as if sheltering old secrets from the wind. From morning until dusk, the air smelled of glue, lamp oil, and pressed leather. When the bells of St. Giles tolled, their sound bounced among the hills, slipping through the cracked panes of the tiny front window, mixing with the scratch of a knife trimming vellum. There, amid shavings and curling fibers, grew a girl, small, light-footed, and curious beyond reason. Her father would sometimes joke that she learned her letters before she learned her steps. She could not remember the beginning of either. She only knew the rhythm of his work, the thud of the laying hammer, the hiss of steam rising from the press, the creak of boards as another book was clamped tight for drying. Each movement was deliberate, shaped by patience. When he talked, it was more to the tools than to her, as though each brush and bone folder had a soul to coax. The front room held customers by the day. A clergyman with ink on his cuffs, a student who could barely pay, a lady clutching her ruined prayer book as if it were a relic of her heart. Some days brought laughter, others the silence of unpaid promises. During winter, her father burned scraps of paper to save coal. The scent of singed parchment made her think of faraway places, churches, perhaps, or libraries she would never see. In the evening, she rubbed her fingers sticky with paste and counted the coins he placed in a small tin box. The sum never seemed large enough, though he spoke of it as if it were plenty. Childhood wove itself around those corners of modest trade. The girl liked the feel of paper more than dolls, the gleam of gold powder caught under her nails. She would sharpen knives with exaggerated care, pretending she was an apprentice in a great printing house, one who might someday bind volumes for kings. Her father laughed at that, ruffling her dark hair. "Kings have their palace binders, lass," he once said, "and they pay no better, I'd wager." Yet he looked pleased all the same. Outside, the city never kept still. Milk carts clattered over stones, children called through fog, and the air carried the mingled reek of fish, soap, and smoke. From the threshold, she watched shadows slip along the wind, the poor hauling coal sacks, apprentices with inky sleeves, and sometimes soldiers in red coats whose boots glittered even in the dim. A fortune-teller lived 3 doors away. On autumn nights, the sound of her charms jingling mixed with fiddle music from the tavern. Superstition was as common a neighbor as rain. Her father dismissed such things, but still turned the money box twice before closing. For luck, he'd say, pretending not to believe it mattered. Customers often came not only for work, but for talk. Some remembered her mother, though few spoke of her plainly. The girl learned to fill silence with observation. The way one man's voice trembled when asked his name, or how a woman traced the edges of her book as if fearful of losing it again. Her father said that books were the only honest witnesses. They told what they had seen, even after the living had forgotten. By midsummer, the sun reached the shelves only a few minutes each day, striking upon cracked spines and gilded lettering that glowed briefly before dulling back into brown. Those were her favorite moments, when she pressed her palm against the spot of warmth on the work table and felt time pause just for a breath. Sometimes she imagined the bound pages humming softly together, each one alive with words too faint for human hearing. Thomas often appeared in those days, a wiry boy who carried errands between shops. He was quick of hand and quicker of wit, though he spent most of it teasing her. His whistle announced him long before he stepped through the door. He would linger with excuses, to fetch scraps, deliver invoices, or ask for glue. Her father tolerated him, perhaps because the boy brought light into the darker corners of the bindery. Together they cleaned brushes, stacked boards, shared stolen apples. In the evenings, they watched the passers-by from the window and made up stories about them. One man was a poet in disguise, another a thief from London. She didn't know then how such stories would one day turn toward truth. When winter returned, frost crept across the inside of the glass. Candlelight bent through it, faint and amber. Her father's sight worsened that year. He mistook letters, nicked his fingers more often, and spoke less. She took on the finer tasks, trimming with the paring knife, brushing gold leaf onto the spine. The work steadied her. The occasional hiss of his breath behind her guided her hands as if some invisible cord passed between them. On Sundays, when the shop closed, she read softly from a psalter, for his eyes tired by dusk. He would smile and say the words still sounded new. Rumors drifted with the winter winds, a new press opening on the other side of town, cheaper bindings from the south. Her father muttered that craft was dying, replaced by machinery and shortcuts. The girl listened, half understanding, yet felt a vague fear take root, that one day no one would care for careful hands, for thread drawn true across paper grain. At night she dreamed of endless halls filled with unbound leaves, fluttering like doves. One early spring morning, the city awoke to fog the color of honey. The girl walked alone down the slope toward the market for paste powder. The streets were nearly silent. Only a cooper was at work, hammering faintly somewhere ahead. Passing the closes, she saw women sweeping steps, scattering salt by habit against evil talk. It all seemed strangely calm, as if the city itself were breathing slowly after a long illness. She carried her little pouch of coin, hidden beneath her shawl, aware of how easily fortune, or misfortune, could find a person unprepared. Still, she felt a lightness, the pleasing ache of a body beginning to understand its own strength. By the time she returned, her father was repairing a spine from the university library, his thinning hair catching the sunlight like pale thread. "You were gone long enough," he told her gently, though there was no anger in it. She placed the paste by his side, and together they bent over the tome. The pages crackled faintly. She traced the crease between signatures, and he nodded in approval, eyes glinting with pride that needed no words. The evening drew on as they worked. Somewhere beyond the thick walls, bells tolled the hour. Candle flames dipped and recovered. the room filled with the soft rasp of file against leather, the slow heartbeat of industry older than their names. She leaned closer, breathing in the scent of time itself, the hush of centuries resting quiet between her fingertips. Later, when she would think back on this first stage of her life, it would seem almost like a dream. The gentle rhythm of work, the trust in her father's presence, the city still half closed to her. Under the weight of glue and gold dust, she did not yet see how fragile that peace was. But on that night, as the fire crackled low and the fog pressed faintly at the shutters, the world felt whole, held together by thread, patience, and love that asked for nothing in return. Morning light came reluctantly that year, scarcely pushing through the smog that rolled above the roofs. The shop windows wore a pale film of dust that dulled everything behind them. The worn bench, the piles of cloth, the familiar outline of her father hunched at work. Life slipped, unhurried, from one day to the next, bound by routine like the stitching on a spine. Since the winter when the girl had fetched paste for their bindings, time had tightened around her shoulders, shaping her from child to craftswoman. The father no longer trusted his eyes for fine detail. Threads crisscrossed, letters blurred, colors blended into the same tired brown. Yet his hands still moved with a kind of prideful stubbornness, guiding hers as if invisible knowledge might pass from his fingertips to hers. He spoke less now, his sentences trimmed like the edges of vellum. She learned that silence had many languages: fatigue, approval, worry, love. The work itself grew heavier. Customers grew demanding, and prices wavered with each market change. She learned to bargain. The merchants haggled as though their silver were holy. The students promised payment after examinations that never came. She smiled with restraint, taking notes in a ledger she still could not keep balanced. The debts sat like forgotten stains, faint yet impossible to remove. Sometimes, after closing, she spread the coins across the table to count them twice, running her forefinger over the small pile until the numbers formed a mocking rhythm in her head. Outside, the city stretched and groaned with growth. New buildings climbed over old ones. The hum of presses echoed from Jefferson's Yard down on Cowgate. What her father had once called art was quickly becoming trade. Still, she held her place against the world's impatience. Day after day she dipped brushes into paste, flattened bubbles under calfskin, adjusted the linen cords that bound each gathering of paper together. Her wrists ached, but her spirit sharpened with the same precision as her paring knife. Thomas was gone by then, drawn to the docks by talk of ships and wages paid weekly. Before he left, he joked that she would one day bind his name in gold. She laughed, though it hurt, watching him vanish around the corner with sea salt still clinging to his coat. His absence left an empty rhythm in her hours. Some evenings she caught herself glancing toward the doorway, as if expecting his whistle. Work filled the pause he left behind, but the silence between hammer strokes seemed longer afterward. As spring crept back into rough gardens, she began traveling across the city to deliver finished orders herself. The walk to Newtown unfurled another world. Clean facades, polished windows, people whose gloves alone cost more than she earned in a week. Behind every curtsy and measured word, she sensed a distance that no honesty could bridge. Yet on rare occasions, kindness flickered. A merchant's wife asking about her father's health, an elderly lawyer paying a penny more than agreed. Such moments warmed her like candlelight, though she smiled cautiously when they passed. At home, supper had become a simple ritual. 2 bowls, 1 loaf. Silence broken only by the sound of her father's shallow breath. He tired easily, often leaving tasks unfinished. The workbench became her kingdom. She took in repairs from the university, ailments of paper and spine that would have frightened her once. Now she disassembled the fragile books herself, not daring to think of what might happen if she failed. Each project taught her a quiet arithmetic of patience. How many strokes before the knife dulled? How long the glue could sit before turning grainy? She began to understand, without being told, why her father sometimes stared into the coals after closing. Because life itself was not much different from a book whose ending one must imagine before it is bound. By midsummer, silver-haired customers came asking for her instead of her father. "The lass's hand is finer," they said, and he pretended not to hear. Pride and sorrow folded together inside him like mismatched pages. Once, she caught him watching her finish a cover, his face a mixture of marvel and loss. He reached out, then withdrew his hand, murmuring only that she should charge higher than they expected. Illness followed that autumn, scarcely named, but always present. His cough deepened, and the yard outside thickened with early rain. She rose before dawn to stoke the fire, mix glue, slice parchment. Each movement had the dull comfort of repetition. She believed she could keep everything intact if only she worked faster, steadier, longer. When he dozed, she copied his notes into a ledger. Recipes for adhesives, lists of reliable clients, tiny sketches of decorative tools long since sold. In those pages, she found hints of his younger life, years when the shop had thrived enough for him to hire apprentices. Something inside her tightened, a fear that she might never surpass what he once had been. Work drew her past fatigue into something quieter, almost trance-like. She listened for the small satisfactions, the clean sound of a knife finishing its cut, the dull shimmer of gold leaf after pressing, the sigh of paper returning to its rightful shape. These were her fortunes now, measured in sensations rather than coins. Still, coin held its power. Each time she passed the ironmonger's window, she admired the padlock she could not yet afford for the shop door, knowing some night it would matter. The city changed tone with the first frost. Streets echoed with costermongers calling apples cheaper than yesterday, chimney smoke turning thick as wool. A new proclamation spread through households, taxes on certain imports, threatening prices of cloth and glue. She spent one evening calculating what it would mean for their supplies and concluded that nothing honest was ever safe for long. It was then she began taking extra commissions, offering to mend ledgers for shops run by women like herself, widows, daughters, wives struggling to keep afloat. Their talk comforted her more than confession ever could. They traded advice in half-whispers: how to bargain with a supplier, how to judge a patron's honesty by the shine of his shoes. Months later, she returned from delivering a batch of repairs to find her father asleep in his chair beside the fire. The air reeked of damp wool and glue. Outside, wind scraped the shutters with the claws of bare branches. He woke suddenly, smiling faintly, and said he had dreamt of her mother, that she had laughed while hanging laundry in sunlight he could not describe. His voice was slow, the words heavy with memory. When he slept again, she sat quietly, listening to the coals settle. For a long while, the shop seemed larger than usual, as though space itself were stretching to make room for absence. The next morning, she rose before him. She stood by the window watching customers hurry past, a minister clutching a notebook, an apprentice dragging a box, a woman shielding her face from the drizzle with a shawl. It was an ordinary day. She took up the first volume on the bench, a torn family Bible whose owner had promised 1 shilling upon delivery. Her knife glided along the peeling spine, exposing thin cords within. For a moment she simply watched the frayed threads trembling between light and shadow. Somewhere beneath her fingertips lay the quiet pattern of endurance she had inherited without choosing. As hours passed, she caught sight of her father's reflection in the window, distant, almost spectral. He watched her from his chair with that same look of quiet pride. She did not turn around. The leather responded more cleanly when she didn't break concentration. Outside, the bells struck noon. The shop smelled of hide glue and cold iron. She pressed the binding into place and held it firmly until the thread cooled, sealing the past and the present together with a single, patient gesture. When evening came, the day's coins rested on the table. The candle flickered low, the sound of the city dulled to a hush. She felt the stirrings of something uncertain. Loneliness, perhaps, or the dim awareness of change already begun. Above the shutter's cracks, the sky blushed faintly with smoke and dusk. She knew tomorrow would bring the same labor, the same exchanges of politeness and coin. But something unseen had already begun to shift, quietly, as glue drying beneath the weight of a board. The spring rain came soft and persistent, whispering across the windows of the bindery like gentle fingers. The streets of Edinburgh glistened under the gray morning, their puddles shimmering with pewter light. Inside the little shop, the smell of damp paper mingled with the warmth of glue heating over coals. Work had not stopped. It never did. She stood at the long table, her sleeves rolled and worn, restoring a heavy folio wrapped in cracked calfskin. The book was older than her grandfather would have been, its cover buckled and its gilt mostly gone. It was a commission from a collector across town, a man who spoke with the easy confidence of wealth. When his porter brought the volume through the door, wrapped in rough linen, her curiosity stirred before she could silence it. The collector had not said what it contained, only that it must be handled with discretion. Discretion, she understood. Books came bearing not just stories, but secrets. Letters never sent. Family crests overpainted. Pages replaced to erase an inconvenient truth. Still, there was something uneasy in how this one seemed to hold its breath. The edges of the pages were swollen as if from hidden moisture, and the spine bulged irregularly, suggesting a fault beneath the gilding. But she thought little of it. The city itself was full of oddities, every wall hiding its own unswept corner. Days passed in the same rhythm, work, meals, and weary rest. Yet with each hour she spent upon the old tome, the sense of unease thickened. The stitching was unlike any she had seen. Whoever had repaired it last had done so with an intensity bordering on secrecy. She trimmed the cords carefully, separating the gatherings one by one until she reached the middle section. There the stitching tightened, doubled upon itself, as if binding not paper, but intent. The knife caught for a moment, cutting through something tougher than thread. A faint rustle followed, the sound of thin paper freeing itself from captivity. She paused, heart thumping. Under the layer of torn linen, a small slip of parchment had been folded into a narrow crease, sewn deliberately within the spine. At first, she thought it only a binder's note, a mark of ownership or inventory, nothing more. But curiosity broke her restraint. She laid the scrap on the table, flattened it, and saw cramped, hurried writing in faded brown ink. The script was uneven, betraying haste or fear. The words were few. She read them twice, scarcely breathing. Beneath the stairs, where the oil lamp dripped. Forgive my silence. The truth was taken by the flood. I am not to blame. She sat motionless for a long moment, the steady hum of rain filling the shop. The sentence felt like a pulse from another century, too intimate to belong in a book. She lifted her eyes toward the window. Outside, the alley was fogged and empty. Somewhere distant, a gate creaked in the wind. Her first instinct was to hide the parchment again. Whatever mystery it carried was none of hers. But habit, old, stubborn habit, would not rest. Books told her that nothing is meaningless if preserved in ink. The note was placed here to be found, she reasoned, or perhaps to be hidden forever. Either way, it had survived time's slow teeth to reach her table. Later that day, the collector's messenger came to check on her progress. He was a thin man in an overcoat too fine for the weather, with gloves so tight she could see the veins beneath. His politeness was exact, rehearsed. When he inquired about the condition of the folio, she replied with practiced calm, saying only that its restoration would take longer than expected. He nodded once, his expression unreadable, and departed as swiftly as he'd come. After he left, she caught herself locking the shop door, something she rarely did during daylight. The scrap of parchment lay folded within her sleeve. It warmed against her skin, as if it possessed its own faint life. That evening, as the fire burned low, she took it out again, memorized every curve of the letters, and tucked it behind the false bottom of a drawer. Sleep came late, full of uneasy dreams where black water ran under old stone stairs. The next morning brought wind from the sea and the sound of merchants setting up their stalls. She returned to work before the sky cleared, yet nothing in the shop seemed as it had before. Each creak of wood, each passing step outside, sharpened her ears. It felt absurd to imagine danger from a scrap of parchment, but she found herself glancing at the door nonetheless. At noon, a stranger arrived. He introduced himself as Mr. Grant, a clerk from a legal office near George Street, sent, he said, on behalf of the collector. His pleasant voice could not disguise a faint curiosity as his eyes lingered on the dismantled folio. He asked whether she had found anything within the binding, for, as he claimed, the client suspected alterations done by a former owner. She hesitated. Honesty was a virtue her father had prized, but caution had kept them safe through lean years. "Nothing unusual," she answered, her tone steady, though her heart quickened. Mr. Grant watched her closely for a moment before nodding and taking his leave. His glove brushed a droplet of paste from the edge of the table. Then he was gone, his boots clicking faintly down the wind. The air felt thicker after his departure. She leaned against the bench, her palms damp. So, the collector knew, or guessed, that the book held more than text. Whatever truth the parchment concealed, she was no longer the only one aware of its existence. For several nights, she avoided the drawer where she had hidden it, yet the note seemed to call to her, whispering questions she could not silence. Who wrote it? What flood? And, beneath which stairs had something been concealed. She began visiting the library when errands took her near the high street, searching the catalogue for records of floods, deaths, or disappearances. The city held no shortage of tragedies, but none matched the tone of that plea, "Forgive my silence." As she walked home one evening through the mist, she passed a row of half-collapsed houses near the riverbank. The smell of damp stone and stagnant water caught in her throat. She imagined the writer crouched there by lamplight, sealing his confession into a book that would travel through time until her hands found it. The thought both chilled and thrilled her. Her father's old friend, the bookseller's widow, who often brought her Latin tracts to restore, noticed her distraction. "You read ghosts instead of words," the woman said gently, half jesting. The restorer smiled but said nothing. Ghosts, she thought, were not always seen. Some were waiting between pages, biding their time. A week later, she delivered a finished set of bindings to the university library and passed by a group of scholars muttering about a recent sale of rare manuscripts. Among the names mentioned was that of the same collector who had sent her the mysterious folio. They spoke of his interest in unusual acquisitions, especially those tied to unsolved matters of estate. One scholar laughed darkly, saying the man might sooner find gallows than gratitude if he pried too deep. She paused, pretending to read a posted notice, while her thoughts tangled. The words beneath the stairs took on a sharper outline. A death, perhaps? A hidden crime hushed by bribes and inheritance? She realized then that her discovery placed her closer to that world of wealth and secrecy than she had ever wanted to be. The note had turned from curiosity to possession. It bound her as surely as any thread. That night she worked until the candle burned low. The shop lay still, her father's tools arranged in the same order he had taught her. She opened the drawer, drew out the parchment, and unfolded it carefully. The ink had thinned, but not vanished. It no longer looked ancient. It looked immediate, trembling on the edge of speech. Rain began to fall again, whispering through the roof tiles. She stared at the words until they seemed to shift under her gaze, the way water ripples in lamplight. The story they hinted at was not complete. It waited for its reader to finish it. And in that quiet room, filled with the scent of glue and old leather, she felt the faint but certain sense that her life had turned a page, and that nothing, however small, could ever be sewn shut again. Autumn returned on a tide of cold rain and smoke. Chimneys exhaled their gray breath across the slanted roofs, and the wind carried with it the first scent of winter, charred peat, wet wool, and distant sea salt. The bindery stood as it always had, wedged between a cooper's yard and a stairwell that never stopped dripping. Yet inside, something silent and invisible had shifted. The message from the hidden binding had altered her work beyond measure. What once had been comfort, routine, repetition, the humble dignity of mending torn paper, had become a kind of confinement. The bench that used to hum with order now pressed upon her like a witness. Each book she opened seemed to hold its own secret she might one day be unable to return to silence. The scrap of parchment, locked away where no one could find it, weighed more than any of her heavy tomes. The collector had not sent for his folio in weeks. That absence would once have passed unmarked, but now it felt deliberate. Mr. Grant, the lawyer's clerk, returned instead, always polite, always asking about progress. He chose his words carefully, as though testing hers for cracks. she answered with equal care, using the tone of ordinary business. Nevertheless, she saw the flicker in his expression when his eyes met hers: curiosity, unease, perhaps even warning. Work kept her steady through the shorter days. The shop filled with faint light that dimmed before evening, and she brought the lamp closer to the table to keep her thoughts in focus. The gold leaf shimmered as before, but the rhythm of her hands was no longer the same. Rest was impossible. Each creak of wood or stray footstep outside made her heart rise. She began locking the shutters earlier, keeping a single candle burning until late. Her father's health declined without drama or complaint. He rarely mentioned pain, but some days he hardly moved from his chair. She read to him while she worked, her voice the only thing that filled the silence between the tongs and the hiss of the brazier. One night he spoke unexpectedly after a long spell of quiet. "There's a burden you carry that's not mine," he said, his voice hoarse. "Let no book take the breath from your own chest." The words startled her, as if he had seen more than she had ever told. She asked no questions. He did not repeat himself. When morning came, he seemed to have forgotten, though he gave her a look that lingered longer than usual before turning back to doze. Weeks passed in such subdued harmony, outward stillness sheltering inward unrest. The widow who sold books across the street visited now and then, bringing gossip. There had been talk of theft among the city's rare collectors, engravings gone missing, maps switched for forgeries, a dealer found dead by the river with an empty satchel. The mention struck her like a touch of frost, though she kept her expression calm. The widow, mistaking her silence for disinterest, added that the police suspected smugglers. "Or scholars," she said wryly, "which is the same breed, only quieter." That night the restorer opened her drawer again. The parchment lay folded, thin as a breath. She considered burning it, ending its hold over her life, but fire felt too final. Knowledge once seen could not be unlearned. She returned it to its hiding place beneath the false bottom, then sat by the hearth listening to the coals fall in on themselves. The warmth reached only her hands, leaving the rest of her chilled. When her father died near the year's end, the world did not stop. He passed quietly, one deep sigh, and then no more. The priest spoke plain words, and a few neighbors came with kindness in their pockets. By dusk, the shop was silent again, its sounds now belonging only to her. She moved as though half ghost herself, keeping busy to avoid thought. But as she cleaned his workbench, she found a folded scrap among his papers, a list of clients written in his slanted script, and at the bottom, a name she recognized at once. The same collector. Her head swam. How long had her father known him? The date beside the name was old, nearly 20 years ago. Had the man brought books here before? There was no note of what work had been done, only a faint ink blot beside the name, as if the pen had paused on hesitation. She pressed the page flat, unable to decide whether it brought clarity or confusion. The next morning she returned the folio to its wrapping of linen and carried it through the fog to the address she had been given months before. The townhouse stood in Newtown, its ashlar walls polite and severe. She hesitated on the step before knocking. A servant admitted her, his expression careful, neither warm nor unkind. The collector, Mr. Haldane, received her in a study that smelled of beeswax and old smoke. He was not as she remembered him. Thinner, perhaps, and paler, his hands speckled with age. He asked about her father first, speaking the words of condolence as though they were part of a ritual. Then his tone sharpened. Was the restoration complete? Were there any discoveries? She met his gaze steadily. "The book is whole again," she said. "Nothing was damaged." "Nothing added." He nodded but did not smile. "I am in your debt." He reached for his purse, but she lifted her hand to refuse the extra coin he offered. Money was not what she feared from him. When she turned to leave, she felt his eyes on her back like a weight, though whether from suspicion or gratitude she could not tell. After that day, peace did not return. At every delivery, in every new commission, she sensed a presence trailing her thoughts. Once she caught Mr. Grant standing across the street, pretending to read a notice. Another time, the widow mentioned that someone had inquired about her father's ledgers, asking what books had passed through his shop in his later years. She dismissed the matter outwardly, but inside the knot tightened. Her work became her refuge again, though even the bindings seemed altered by her unease. On sleepless nights, she read by lamplight from the Psalms, the words smudged by candle smoke. Out of habit, she polished the brass corners of an old family Bible her father had repaired long ago. When she lifted its cover, a thought came unbidden. How easy it would be for anyone to hide truth between such pages, trusting time to guard it. The idea frightened her, yet somewhere beneath that fear lay a spark of understanding. The binding and the secret were one structure. Both held together the visible and the hidden. In early spring, she received another visit from Mr. Grant. He came at dusk, when most shutters were drawn. The light behind him was bruised with rain. He carried no commission this time, only an odd request, to inspect the folio again, as the collector believed certain errors remained. She told him calmly that the book had been returned, and that her records held proof. He thanked her, but his glance toward the cabinet where she kept customer accounts did not go unnoticed. When he left, she followed him to the threshold and shut the door firmly behind him. The latch clicked louder than usual. She leaned her back against the wood for a long while. The smell of the rain came through the cracks, metallic, clean, and bitter. The city seemed to hold its breath. That night she dreamed of descending damp stone steps. At the bottom was the sound of dripping, steady and cold. She reached for a lamp that would not light. The darkness pressed close until she woke with her hands clenched in the quilt. Morning brought no comfort. She resolved, for the first time, to trace the source of the note. The words, "beneath the stairs," returned with renewed urgency. Where had Mr. Haldane obtained the book? She found courage in the steadiness of daylight, telling herself it was only to satisfy reason, not fear. She walked across town to the printer who often worked with collectors and asked casually about shipments from estates. The printer, unsuspecting, mentioned that Haldane had purchased several volumes from a dissolved household years ago, a house that had suffered flood damage by the water of Leith. The phrase cut through her thoughts like a blade. A flood. A truth taken by the flood. She thanked the man and left before he could know what meaning his words had given her. Back in the shop, she sat long beside the brazier, thinking of the generations that had passed through Edinburgh's narrow veins, each leaving behind a residue of sin, grief, or kindness. The air outside was thick with chimney smoke, but she seemed to see, beneath its gray shroud, a network of invisible lines threading through time and action. Perhaps the dead bound themselves to the living as pages to cover, hidden until reopened. When the candle guttered low, she took her knife and sliced a narrow strip of vellum, marking the shape of her resolve. Without ceremony, she opened her father's ledger, added a blank line under the old collector's name, and in careful script wrote only one word beside it: truth. Then she closed the book gently and pressed her palm against its worn surface, feeling both tremor and calm. Outside, the rain continued with the patience of eternity. The night wrapped the city, and within it, the faint tremor of discovery waited, unseen, between the beating of her heart and the ticking of the clock that had once kept pace with her father's hand. The thaw that followed was slow and grudging. The narrow streets ran with dark water, carrying away winter's residue, ashes, straw, and the splintered remains of barrels. In the bindery, the air smelled of damp boards and fresh glue. She worked with the windows open to keep the walls from sweating, though the breath of March still cut through her sleeves. The year had turned, yet something in her refused to turn with it. The discovery of the old ledger's note and the flood by the water of Leith weighed on her mind like a riddle without promise of resolution. Each evening, she thought she might let the matter fade, yet by dawn the same restlessness returned. Curiosity had hardened into duty, though she could scarcely say to whom. Her commissions multiplied that spring. Word of her precision had spread among collectors, and new names came to the ledger every week. Among them appeared one she did not recognize, a Mrs. Calder, widow of a merchant from the northern quarter. The woman brought a small parcel, wrapped in coarse linen and bound with twine. It contained a travel journal whose binding had dissolved in the damp. When she opened it, a faint scent of river mud rose from the pages. The woman noticed her expression. "We lived by the water of Leith then," she said quietly. "The flood came sudden." For a long moment, the restorer's hands froze. She asked a few cautious questions, mentioning that she had recently repaired old folios from estates near the same river. Mrs. Calder hesitated, weighing something unsaid. "A ruin that year," she murmured. "Some lives lost, some fortunes remade. Those who could pay kept their stories dry." She smiled faintly, as if to dismiss the subject, and paid in advance. But the tremor in her hand betrayed nerves that years of widowhood had not dulled. After she left, the bookbinder sat unmoving, tracing the journal's worn cover. The parchment note in her drawer echoed through her thoughts, its mention of silence, the flood, the plea for forgiveness. The ink in that message had been thick with fear, not confession. She began reading carefully through the pages as she cleaned them. The journal recorded a merchant's trades, sea shipments, and daily ledgers, mundane details at first glance. But midway through, one entry mentioned a visit to a household by Dean Village. The entry ended abruptly mid-sentence, blotched by water. The next leaf was missing entirely. That evening, she restored the missing edge with new parchment, but left the space blank, unable to replace what had been deliberately torn out. Outside, twilight draped the city roofs in indigo, smoke from chimneys rising straight in the still air. Beneath the quiet, she felt the hum of the unseen, memory, guilt, or history, murmuring through walls older than her own name. A few days later, she crossed the bridge near the river to deliver bindings. The air was raw and moss-scented. Houses leaned at odd angles above the flow, as if reluctant to watch the water that had betrayed them once. She lingered where the mill path curved behind the warehouses. The stones still bore marks of the high water line. Closing her eyes, she imagined that night, the lamp flame flickering against stairs, half submerged, the frantic voices, the cold. She saw, perhaps too clearly, someone crouching in haste, hiding a folded plea within the hollow of a book. As she opened her eyes, a figure approached from the bend. It was Mr. Grant, hat pulled low, coat fastened despite the mild day. Surprise rose and settled quickly between them. He greeted her politely, as one does an acquaintance whose secrets are common knowledge. "It is rare to find you from your shop," he said. She replied that she had errands. His smile was practiced, but his gaze darted toward the river. "Such floods leave curious ruins," he observed. "The ground here remembers." Then, as if parting from idle talk, added, "You might ask yourself who wrote what you found before you decide its meaning." Before she could ask what he meant, he tipped his hat and strode away. His words struck with the precision of a knife, cutting without visible wound. He knew. Perhaps he had known all along. When she returned home, the city lights were appearing one by one. In the shop's stillness, every sound was magnified. The ropes creaking against rafters, embers murmuring, the tick of the wall clock like a heartbeat. She took out the parchment and laid it beside the restored journal. The inks were not the same, yet both carried the same heavy hand of someone not trained to write. She began to wonder if the author of the hidden note was no scholar, but a servant or tradesman, someone who had seen too much. Her days became divided between routine and inquiry. She repaired legal ledgers for clerks who spoke freely once bribed with tea. From them, she learned that the estate ruined in the flood had belonged to a family named Kerr, a respected lineage nearly erased when the river rose. Their surviving heir, a widowed lady, had since remarried. Her second husband was none other than Mr. Haldane, the collector. The realization pulled the threads of her unease into one fabric. The folio, the note, the flood, the collector, they were all bound by a single narrative. Yet she could see only fragments. Whether the message accused or absolved, she could not tell. "I am not to blame." Those words sounded less like innocence than a last defense against truth discovered. A week of sleepless nights followed, her mind a reel of possibilities. Then came a letter, sealed with unfamiliar wax, bearing no return mark. The handwriting was refined, though uncertain in tone. "Madam, the book you restored for my husband belongs truly to me, and I ask that you visit me discreetly, for I have matters of which I cannot speak through others." It was signed, Elizabeth Haldane. She read the letter thrice before folding it shut. The meeting seemed a risk, yet curiosity outweighed prudence. The next afternoon, she walked the steep lanes to a townhouse near Charlotte Square. Mrs. Haldane received her in a parlor dim with gauze curtains. The woman's beauty had weathered like silk kept too close to the sun. What remained was refinement mixed with weariness. "You handled the old folio?" Mrs. Haldane asked quietly. The restorer nodded. "My husband believes it his, but it was once in my family. I've dreamt of it each night, the book that keeps returning. Did you notice anything within it?" The restorer hesitated, uncertain how much this woman already knew. "It was in poor condition," she replied at last. "I repaired what I found." Mrs. Haldane's eyes searched hers. "There was talk," she continued, her voice tightening, "when my first household fell in ruin, the drowning of a servant girl. They called it accident. But my husband was then only our family's advisor, not yet my husband. He alone stayed behind to manage what remained after the flood." A clock ticked in the corner. Neither woman moved. The meaning hung like dust in a narrow sunbeam. Finally, Mrs. Haldane sighed, her fingers tracing the edge of the armrest. "If words were hidden in that book, they were not meant for his eyes. Perhaps they reached the right one instead." When the restorer left, drizzle veiled the sky, silvering the cobbles. Her thoughts tangled but did not burst into fear. She understood now that the note's voice belonged to a silenced witness, one who had tried to speak through the fabric of a book. Perhaps the secret death had been an accident. Perhaps not. Yet the past refused erasure, written not in ink, but in conscience. That night she wrote a simple summary of what she had learned, a record for herself alone, and pressed it between two spare sheets of parchment. She placed it in one of her father's unfinished bindings, a volume of sermons, sealing it with thread so pale it would vanish among the stitches. She worked steadily, as if the act of binding truth could grant it peace. By midnight the lamp guttered low. She stood at the window, watching the rain relight the cobbles. Somewhere in the dark city, Mr. Haldane arranged his library by candlelight, believing all his stories safely caged on their shelves. Somewhere else, the widow who had lost her servant woman whispered a prayer for sleep. She turned from the window, her reflection thin against the glass. Beneath her weariness stirred something like resolve, not vengeance, not pity, but understanding. Secrets, she knew now, were their own bindings. They held the living together more tightly than love or law. For once she felt neither fear nor triumph at holding this one, only acceptance, like the press closing gently upon a finished book, leaving its pattern beneath the dust for those who might one day choose to read. The summer came late that year. It drifted in behind cold rain, as if uncertain of its welcome. Along the riverbanks, damp grass still smelled of winter, and mist hung over the lanes until midday. The bindery, however, remained warm, its air filled with the scent of leather, starch, and smoldering coal dust. Time, inside the little shop, obeyed a different season, the slow rhythm of repair, the whisper of knife over paper, the murmur of threads pulled taut. Months had passed since Mrs. Haldane's quiet confession. The restorer had resumed her work with outward composure, though the memory of that meeting looped endlessly beneath her thoughts. The dead servant, the hidden message, the family that had drowned twice, once in the flood and once in silence. The knowledge clung to her like a persistent scent that neither washing nor prayer could dispel. Life outside the shop seemed unchanged. Children chased hoops down the cobbled street. Merchants cursed the price of paper. The church bell tolled each evening. Yet within her, a subtle crack widened. The secret no longer frightened her. It had become a presence, patient and watchful, reminding her that every object in her care might hold something unspoken beneath its stitching. One morning, a letter arrived bearing neither crest nor signature, only a folded sheet in coarse handwriting. It requested her presence at a private room in a tavern by the grass market. Urgent, it said, concerning her late father's affairs. She doubted the claim, but went nonetheless, curiosity guiding her more than sense. The tavern smelled of ale and sawdust, its low beams blackened by years of smoke. In a back corner sat Mr. Grant, hat beside him, eyes shadowed. He greeted her as though expecting reproach, and for a time they spoke in the formal rhythm of strangers. But formality could not hold their history at bay. He confessed, in a voice measured but brittle, that long ago her father had handled certain bound documents for the Kerr estate, records that disappeared after the flood. "Not through ill intent," he said quickly, "but as a favor. For protection." Those books, he explained, had carried evidence of debts, rewritten wills, small falsehoods that shielded the powerful at the expense of the forgotten. "You have found one remnant of it," he added, gazing toward his cup. She asked what became of the missing servant. He hesitated, then drank, as though the ale might dissolve the memory. "She knew something, a witness no one wished to question. Perhaps she slipped. Or perhaps she was helped to slip." For a long moment neither spoke. The noise of laughter from the adjoining room felt unreal, as if belonging to another century. When at last she rose to leave, he caught her sleeve gently, his expression stripped of pretense. "Whatever wrong you think we did, it was done too long ago to mend by speech. But truth can sink or survive as you will it. Choose carefully what you bind next." Outside, the wind lifted her shawl and scattered rain through the square. She walked without direction, letting the streets decide her path. Each turn led downward, toward the smell of the river. The air grew colder, touched with the scent of iron and moss. By the time she reached the mills, dusk had gathered, a blue shadow clinging to the stones. The water of Leith moved slowly under the bridge, bearing flecks of foam. Echoes of her father's stories returned, of floods that erased, of trades lost and remade. Near one rotted stairwell, she saw the dark outline of the shop ruins that had once belonged to the Kerrs. The steps disappeared into shadow beneath the waterline. "Beneath the stairs," the note had said. The thought neither beckoned nor warned, it simply existed, steady as breath. She knelt on the lowest stone, the mist cool against her face. For a time she listened. The drip of water through cracks, the rustle of grass, the faint groan of a tethered boat. She half expected some token, some proof of what had been hidden. Yet nothing surfaced but a fragment of old rope. Still, the place itself spoke. It told her what all secrets tell, that silence is never empty, only waiting for someone to listen. A carriage passed on the road behind her, its wheels hissing through puddles. She turned and saw a lantern inside, glinting on a familiar profile, Mr. Haldane's. He did not notice her, but his presence there confirmed what instinct already knew, that the past still gripped him too. The following day she shut the shop early. The apprentices from neighboring trades called farewell as she pulled the shutters. Inside, the light fell in golden streaks through dust. She gathered parchment, pens, her father's ledgers, and the cursed note. Slowly, deliberately, she wrote what she had pieced together. Not accusation, not confession, but the story as it seemed to her, of greed, fear, and silence preserved across years. She wrote in the careful hand of her craft, leaving space for the unknown, refusing to judge what could not be proven. When she finished, She stitched the account into the lining of a plain-bound volume of Psalms, pressing the leather closed while the glue cooled. The binding felt lighter than it should have, as though the act of telling had drained some weight from the world. She placed the volume on her highest shelf among unmarked spines, its secret folding quietly into the rest of history. Night fell like ink seeping into paper. The city outside softened into murmurs, carts groaning homeward, footsteps fading between archways. She sat by the window, hands clasped, watching the faint light of oil lamps quiver along the street. Somewhere beyond those glows lived men who measured truth by profit, and women who bore the cost in silence. She wondered which measure was the more enduring. A knock sounded faintly at the door. Through the wavy glass, she saw Thomas's outline, the dockhand, weather-beaten now, his once boyish features aged by salt and travel. She opened the door without words. He stepped inside, shaking off rain, the smell of sea and tar following him. They spoke little. He asked of her father, of work, of life. Her answers were simple, her voice quiet as rustling paper. After a pause, he looked toward the crowded shelves and said, "You still keep the world mended, it seems." It was not a question. It was recognition. Together they shared bread and weak tea at the bench. The storm outside thickened, rain drumming against shutters. She told him of the business growing, half-truth, half-wish, and of her intention to hire an apprentice come winter. He nodded, listening as though each word steadied something in him. When he left, the street was empty, the rain easing to mist. She locked the door, leaned her forehead against the cool wood, and breathed. The world, though unchanged, felt less narrow. The secret was no longer hers alone. Even unspoken, it had diffused into the air, into the turning of days that would wash over it. Toward midnight, she climbed to her small room above the shop. The night smelled of soot and lilac, carried from some garden beyond sight. She sat on the edge of her bed, the window open, and listened to the city's deep murmur. Somewhere, a clock struck, slow and deliberate. She thought then about the books she'd bound over the years, their repaired wounds, their silenced tears, and how each had survived not because they were flawless, but because someone had cared enough to mend them. What the night concealed, she realized, was not only sin or sorrow, but the quiet persistence of compassion. The same hands that hid wrong could also preserve what was good. Beneath the dust, beneath the years, that pattern endured. She lay down without lighting the candle again, her mind steady as an untrembling flame before darkness closed around her, soft and complete. The turning of the year brought quiet days to Edinburgh. Frost rimmed the gutters along the closes, and the air held that clear, metallic stillness which comes before snow. The bindery seemed untouched by time, though the woman who kept it had changed more than she cared to admit. Her hands were steady as ever, yet slower now, and her thoughts, once sharp with suspicion and fear, had begun to soften into reflection. The stranger's letters had ceased. The collector, too, withdrew from view, retreating into the shadows of polite society, where memory rarely followed. Only Mrs. Haldane had written again, a note brief and unembellished. "Thank you for silence." Those 4 words, though mild, freed the restorer from the invisible chain she had carried. She understood that knowledge could wound as deeply as loss, and that mercy sometimes meant leaving a truth unspoken. Work filled her days. Commissions arrived from the university, from printers, from families wishing to preserve what remained of their histories. One morning, she received an order for a new binding, a volume of sermons left to a church by an anonymous donor. When she lifted its cover, the smell of wax and oak drifted up like a ghost. She recognized the craftsmanship at once. It was her father's work. The book had returned to her after all these years, its boards scarred but sound. Embedded in its lining just beneath the gilt, she discovered the faint impression of his handwriting, a note on glue proportions, familiar, practical, unassuming. It made her smile against her will. Life, she thought, was nothing but the slow mending of unfinished things. Thomas visited more often. He had taken a small stall on the Cowgate, selling pamphlets and sailors' tales, and he carried the odor of sea salt wherever he went. Their friendship unfolded like an old map rediscovered, creased, but intact. He would bring bits of news from the docks, stories of ships that left and never returned, and she would listen, half amused, half wistful. Once, as they shared tea beside the stove, he asked if she had ever thought of leaving Edinburgh. She laughed softly. "I have lived so long binding the world together," she said. "It seems unkind to tear my own spine free of it." He grinned at that, yet his glance lingered on her with an affection she did not have the strength to return or refuse. Evenings stretched long and peaceful. She began keeping notes of her repairs, not only materials and pay, but the owners' faces, their gestures, the little truths they revealed. These notes formed a chronicle of the city far more honest than any printed ledger. There was the apothecary who paid in coins so worn they seemed to weep, the widow who left cakes in exchange for scripture repair, the scholar who marked every margin with hesitant prayers. Each book had carried another life folded within it, and by restoring them, she had stitched those fragments into a single quiet testimony. Yet the secret of the old murder lingered in memory, not as threat, but as echo. Sometimes, when dusk turned the street to smoke and the last hammer rang from the distant blacksmith, she would pause over her work and think of that river girl, the unseen servant whose voice had survived only because of ink hidden between pages. It was not pity she felt, so much as kinship. Both had spoken through craft. Both had entrusted truth to the safety of paper. But while one had drowned unheard, the other had lived to tell in silence. One afternoon, while delivering bound books to the library at the Advocate's Close, she met Mr. Grant again. He looked older now, his proud posture eaten by years of guilt. The conversation was brief, balanced between apology and endurance. "You kept your promise," he said quietly. "The city thanks you, though it does not know it." She answered, "It is better not to thank me at all. Some things rest best under dust." He nodded, and they parted without resentment. The following weeks passed uneventfully. Snow came, muffling every sound, softening the harsh corners of stone. From her workshop window she watched crows settle on the chimney tops, black against white, like ink upon vellum. She found herself thinking less about what had been hidden, and more about the small grace of days unremarkable. Each repaired spine, each polished clasp, became an act of thanksgiving. On a late evening, when work had finished, she lit no candle, preferring the pale light of the moon falling through warped panes. She opened her father's ledger, now nearly full, and turned to the last page. The columns of numbers ended halfway down, leaving room for one more entry. In careful hand she wrote the name of her trade, nothing else. Not hers, nor his, nor any mark of family. Only the title of the craft itself, as though the work belonged to everyone who had held a needle in patience or a page in reverence. Then she closed the book, tied its ribbon, and placed it on the upper shelf where her father's lamp once stood. Outside, the bells of St. Giles struck the hour. The sound carried through the wind, clear and solitary. She thought of the countless hours those same bells had watched her grow, child, apprentice, woman. Now they seemed not to summon or to warn, but simply to witness, as stable and indifferent as time. That night she dreamt of the river again, though it no longer ran dark. The water gleamed like glass, showing the reflections of houses, bridges, and distant hills. Beneath its surface lay no drowned faces, only books drifting with open pages, their words dissolving into light. When she woke, she found the dawn pale over the city, the kind of dawn that promises neither trouble nor solace, only continuity. She rose, dressed, and stepped into the street. The cobbles were slick from melting snow, but the air smelled fresh, almost kind. Merchants were setting up stalls, and a lamplighter, late from his rounds, tipped his cap as she passed. It seemed that the whole city, its noise, its weariness, its tenderness, had turned a page with her. Returning to the shop, she set water to boil and laid out her tools. The spine of a heavy atlas waited half-restored on the bench, its pages swollen from damp. She touched the open seam, noting how the thread held firm despite years of strain. Outside, the first light gleamed faintly on the frost-silvered roofs. She smiled at it, without knowing why. By mid-morning, the world had resumed its motion, quiet and exact. Brushes tapped, knives whispered, chords stretched in rhythm. The restorer bent to her work as she always had, the gesture so familiar it felt timeless. The past no longer pressed. It merely existed, like gold dust caught in sunlight, a shimmer, not a burden. And so the ledger of her life closed not with triumph nor regret, but with the simple contentment of work continued, the knowledge that some things mend because one refuses to let them fall apart. Beyond the walls the hum of Edinburgh rose, market cries, cartwheels, a dog barking after fish scraps. Ordinary sounds, yet together they shaped a harmony more enduring than any secret she had uncovered. There, amid the steady breath of glue and rain-damp stone, she found her peace. The mystery was finished, but her work, quiet, endless, and human, remained. Morning light shifted across the old bindery, soft and unhurried, as if reluctant to disturb the books sleeping on the shelves. A pale haze floated through the small window panes, turning every line of dust into silver. The city outside stirred to its own familiar rhythm. Wheel rattles, hawkers' calls, the cry of gulls wandering inland with the tide. But within these walls, time had adopted a slower measure. The restorer, no longer young, sat at her father's workbench. Her shoulders had rounded gently with the years, her movements careful rather than quick, but her hands still knew their language: press, tighten, fold, breathe. Each stroke of the brush carried the precision of decades spent in quiet repair. Around her the shop bore signs of age, scratches on the table darkened by oil, a faint sag in the beam above, and rows of books whose spines gleamed like the patina of old brass. An apprentice moved softly nearby, a keen-eyed youth with ink stains on his wrists. She watched him from the corner of her eye, offering correction not through speech, but through the angle of her own careful motion. He reminded her of herself once, eager, wary of mistakes, devoted to the craft, though he could not yet name what it served. The kettle hissed on the small brazier beside the wall. She poured tea into 2 chipped cups and set one beside the boy's elbow. "Let it steep," she murmured, though her tone held no admonishment. He nodded, still bent over the spine he was rethreading. The scent of glue mingled with steam, carrying that peculiar warmth that made the room both workshop and sanctuary. For the first time in many days, she allowed herself a moment to rest. The ledger lay open before her, the neat columns filled not only with accounts, but with notes in a smaller hand, observations left for those who would come after. She had begun this habit the previous winter, writing fragments between commissions, details of paper grain, recipes of glue, and the rare reflections that slipped from her mind before she could restrain them. One line read, "Books survive not by strength, but by attention." Another, softened by the smear of her palm, said, "To bind is to forgive." She paused on that phrase, hearing in it the echo of times long since gentled by memory. Her father's weary laugh, the murmur of rain the night she had found the hidden message, the voice of Mrs. Haldane fading behind a half-closed door. All of it felt distant, like writing seen through glass, unchanged, untouchable. What had once consumed her thoughts now rested like a layer of dust upon polished wood, part of the texture of her days. Her apprentice spoke suddenly, breaking the silence. "It's good work, this one. The edges are neat." She smiled, startled by his innocent pride. "It is better than I managed at your age," she said. "But skill grows where patience is kept." The boy grinned, returning to his task, humming out of tune. She listened, half amused, half moved by how easily the living inherit the world, without knowing the weight of the hands that shaped it. Outside, church bells drifted over the rooftops, marking the midday hour. The sound filled the small shop, like water rising in a bowl. She closed the ledger gently and turned to her own task, a slender prayer book sent by a chapel in Leith. Its pages were yellowed with salt air, corners curled, stitching loose. But when she opened the cover, the text still shone dark and strong, as though ink could defy time itself. She ran her fingers along the margin and felt the familiar tremor of reverence, the same quiet wonder she had felt as a child beside her father's chair. Work resumed in measured rhythm, thread passing through paper, paste brushed smooth, board pressed under weight. The day outside shifted through layers of color, morning gold to afternoon gray, gray to the faint rose of approaching dusk. Shadows climbed the wall and settled upon the rows of spines, until they appeared as a single body, a library of the unseen. As the evening deepened, she rose to light the lamp. The flame bloomed, modest and steady, casting a halo above the binding press. Its glow caught on the brass tools laid carefully across the bench, the same tools that had once belonged to her father. She traced their outlines with quiet affection. They seemed to her not relics, but companions, old witnesses that had watched her falter, learn, and mend. A knock sounded faintly at the door. She turned, and there stood Thomas. His hair had silvered at the temples, his manner easy, softened by years of routine at the docks. He carried a small parcel wrapped in sailcloth. "Some of the men found these washed ashore near Granton," he said with a chuckle. "Books, of all things. I thought of you the moment I saw them, though they're only scraps." He laid the parcel on the table. Inside were 3 volumes, swollen with salt and time. Their words had run to pale stains, yet between the blurred lines and warped covers lingered the trace of purpose, the stubborn proof that even wreckage tells a story. She examined one carefully, smiling at the faint echo of the long-ago flood that had set her path in motion. "Nothing stays buried forever," she said, her voice low. Thomas looked at her, understanding more than her words allowed. "You'll make them new again, then?" he asked. She shook her head gently. "No, not new, but whole enough to be remembered." They shared tea by the fading fire, speaking little. When he left, the street outside glimmered wet from evening rain, reflecting the lanterns like scattered stars. She watched him disappear down the wind, his figure merging with the hum of the city. Those footsteps, once a part of her youth, now sounded like contentment itself, an answer to a question long ago asked and finally left behind. Returning to the bench, she cleared the space, wiped the boards clean, and lifted one of the ruined books from the parcel. Its pages were crumbling, but still clung to one another, defiant in their decay. Under the lamplight, she began the slow process of restoration, drying, trimming, sewing, pressing. The familiar rhythm wrapped around her like a prayer she no longer needed to recite aloud. The apprentice tidied tools and banked the coals before leaving. When the door closed behind him, the silence deepened but did not feel lonely. She felt, instead, accompanied by the innumerable voices of past and present. Those who had written, those who had read, and those who had simply lived quietly among the bindings. Hours passed unnoticed. The lamp burned lower, its circle of light shrinking to a gentle pool across the table. Dust motes turned golden within it. She set down her tools at last and leaned back, stretching her sore hands. The air smelled of leather, oil, and faintly of the sea from Thomas's parcel. She closed her eyes. In that stillness, she felt something akin to grace. Not the kind sung about in churches, but the small, steady grace of work fulfilled, of patience justifying its long labor, the sins of others, the fear, the hidden truths. All had become fragments folded into the greater pattern, threads indistinguishable from the cloth. The lamp flickered once, then steadied. On the wall, the shadows of the shelves, their rows of quiet spines, seemed almost to breathe. She opened her eyes again and looked upon them with contentment that was simple and deep. These were her companions, her testament. The world might change beyond the window, but within these walls, meaning endured in the touch of a careful hand. Outside, dawn crept nearer, though she did not yet notice the paling sky. The bells would soon sound, and another day's work would begin. She would rise, mend what was broken, teach what she knew, and pour tea that breathed the scent of memory. All this she would do without hurry, for there was no rush anymore. The light above the binding press dimmed to a warm hush. She closed the ledger one final time and let her hand rest upon its cover. In that gesture lay an entire life, patient, quiet, unfinished, yet complete. The city murmured beyond the window. the pages of her days turned gently by the wind, and everything, for the space of one deep breath, felt whole